Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you, Cassandra, and the Conservation Alliance for inviting me to speak today, this afternoon. This is a topic that's really close to my heart, and I do a lot of research in this area, so I was really excited to come and share a little bit about place and its role in public land management. So what I'm going to do today is sort of get these big ideas out there. What is place? Well, what do we mean when we talk about place? Why does it matter? How do we measure it? What is it? How do we measure it? I'll give you some examples from sort of work that has been done in the Valley, and then talk about what we know. And if we do know what we know about place, then how do we integrate it, or what does it tell us as we think about public lands and we manage for people on public lands. And then, of course, being the researcher, I have to add that little line at the bottom as to where is this work going, where is this kind of research moving forward. And I think there'll be time for questions at the end, but if there's something right in the middle that's not really clear, do stop me for that. So we begin just with the idea of, are places important? And there is some talk in the literature and out there saying that as we become a more globalized world, as people travel and migrate, and as moving across the world gets easier, then maybe unique places don't really hold that much importance in a contemporary life. It is nice to end up sometimes for some people in a place that's very different and see something familiar. And there's a sense of comfort maybe in seeing something that they can interpret from something that they know from before. So there's this whole body of literature saying that, well, maybe unique places are not really important in contemporary life. Surprisingly, though, what we are seeing is sort of the counter argument that is saying, no, as we get more homogenized as a community or as a world with people traveling, places that are really unique are gaining more and more importance in our daily lives. And I wanted to put up this photograph here. This is from Antelope Canyon. It's one of my favorite places. And I want to ask you, just sort of ask you, what do you see in one or two words? Can you describe what you're seeing there? Just get a sense from all of you. What do you see? Something, right? Solitude. Grandeur. Yes?
Flooding.
Pardon me? Flooding. Light. So we can go on. Rocks, erosion, texture, there are lots of things. This picture was taken a few years ago when I was hiking in that region, and this is actually on the Navajo Nation. And I was in there at Antelope Canyon, and my guide pulled me aside and said, I want to tell you something because I think you might understand. And I was really honored that he thought I would understand. And I said, definitely, I mean, what is it? And he says, I want to show you something that's unique, that is very special to us, that we don't share generally, but that's very important to us. And he said, turn around and look at the rock features again. And he said, do you notice something? And so I did, and I looked, and I sort of looked, and then it struck me. And he said, do you see the bear looking at the full moon? And I want you to look back at that picture, and do you recognize the bear looking at the full moon? And he said, this is the bear spirit that takes care of the canyon. And he said, it's only there for those who see it and those who will understand it. And to me, this is embodiment of what place is about. It is about the values that we bring to these places. We as human beings bring our sense of what this place is about. And it's a very intangible feeling, but it's a very important feeling. And it is something that we need to be paying attention to. So going back to this idea of place, there is a long history in a lot of other subjects, in a lot of other fields. Geography, anthropology, environmental psychology all talk about places and why places are important. And a lot of this work is coming from the sense of place of communities, neighborhoods, so that's where sort of the history of this idea of place is from. There's this idea that spaces, abstract spaces, become places once we engage with them and we give these spaces meaning. So that's the difference between an abstract space and a place. And these places then result through our interactions with these places. And it's a fundamental means by which we make sense of the world that we live in. It's the meanings that we draw from these places that sort of guide the way we interact with places. And places do a lot more than we think. They really inform the way we behave. They sort of guide what we think or how we behave in certain places. They provide the context for which we live our lives. And I have an example here of this is just a photograph at a gym. We go here, one of the reasons for going here might be to get physically fit. Now, one could argue that a space like this or a place like this fulfills similar goals. We go to a place like this for fulfilling similar goals. However, when we look at a place like this, it contains much more than the physical aspects, which are the rocks, and the biological aspects, which are the plants in there or the wildlife in there. It also contains what are called the social meanings. We think about this place, we interact in this place in a different way than we would if we were in the gym. So the context is making us behave in a very different way. And therefore we see places then as being much more than inert spaces, much more than being containers for physical attributes like rocks and rivers and water, much more than containers for other attributes like wildlife and plants, but also as a container for social meanings. We construct these places in our minds. Now, of all the places, public lands, natural settings such as public lands are of importance. Of course, now that's the focus of the talk today, that's the focus of my research today. So we're only going to sort of restrict ourselves to natural settings, public lands, and not go into the neighborhoods, even though that is slowly sort of finding its way into natural resource management or public land management. We see that public lands are really important because they do have social values and psychological values sort of written into them. We bring these values into them. And they are oftentimes the context within which recreation on these lands occur. So it's not only recreation, but recreation pretty much is contextualized within these places. We go to these places and we recreate in certain ways based on the kind of place that we are in. And if we are to recognize that people are an important component of the landscape, if we are to understand that, then it requires that we find ways in which we can incorporate the values that these people bring into any kind of management that takes place on these kinds of lands. And therefore, one of the ways of getting at these intangibles, what he was trying to tell me about the bear spirit, or sort of the sense of this is a special place for me. What we're trying to get from this is this idea of the bonds that we develop with natural places. I'm sure if I asked you to close your eyes for a minute and think about a favorite place in your life, there's a good chance that it would be a natural place, or a large percent of you would go back to a special place, which might be near a river, a mountaintop, somewhere that is really beautiful, that appeals to you. And so we find ways in which we can begin, we're looking for ways in which we can begin to integrate these values into public land management. We understand these bonds through something called place attachment. And place attachment is basically referring to the bonds that human beings form with these natural places that they are sort of being in, that they're associating themselves with. The idea of place attachment allows us to characterize these bonds, because there are many different ways in which we interact with places, or there are many different reasons for why we get attached to places. So it allows us to characterize what these bonds are, and it also, we are seeing in the last 3 or 4 decades, is becoming increasingly important in land management or natural resource management. It is something that explains a lot of behavior sometimes of people when they're out in nature. If we really had to define it, place attachment can be defined as this emotional. It's either an emotional connection, or it's sometimes called a cognitive connection, or it's a functional, and I'll explain what I mean by these terms, or it's a functional connection or a bond between people and the places that they are at. The research sort of indicates two core dimensions, two sort of sub-themes of place attachment, or two reasons why people get attached to places. The first one is place identity. The idea being that places say something about who we are as people. So if I were a mountaineer, for example, then anything that happened to Mount Everest would mean so much more to me because my identity is very much linked to Mount Everest. So it's about the self, the sense of self, and how a place allows you to define who you are. And so we sometimes get attached to places because those places say something about us as individuals. So this is one of the ways in which we can think about place attachment. The second dimension is called place dependence. And this refers to the idea that sometimes we get attached to a place because there's no other place that we could go to. You could think about the neighborhoods surrounding the Audubon Center. Perhaps there is no other nature that they could go to if they wanted to. And so this place then becomes very important. They depend on this place. There is no other substitute for a place like this. And so you become very attached to a place like this. These are sort of the two core elements, but there are more out there. And I'll talk about those in the next slide. What I have up here, I don't know if you can even see it in the back there, are just statements that we use when we want to measure place identity and place dependence. And I'll read you an example for each of those dimensions. These hills mean a lot to me, or this place means a lot to me. Gets to this identity dimension that I'm talking about. Recreating here is more important than at any other place. This sort of gets at this idea of dependence, that I cannot go anywhere else. And this is sort of a standardized way that we go out there, we measure these different dimensions of place attachment. Beyond the other two, beyond identity and dependence, we also have something called social bonding. And this refers to the idea that sometimes places are really important because they support special relationships that we have. Maybe it's a family tradition to go to the Grand Canyon every summer. And that then becomes special. The Grand Canyon becomes special because it's family time at the Grand Canyon. Maybe South Mountain Park is very important because you meet your friends every Sunday morning at 7 o'clock at one of the trails. And that place is supporting relationships that are special in your life. And therefore, this place becomes really, really important for you. So this is called the social bonding aspect of place attachment, why we get attached to this place. There's some items that we use, which are these sort of statements that we use to measure or to understand social bonding. For example, I have a lot of fond memories about this place, or I have a special connection to this place and the people who come here. So sometimes you might go, oh, you meet someone maybe at a concert somewhere and you go, oh, do you go hiking on Sunday mornings, every Sunday morning at South Mountain Park? Well, so do I. And suddenly this person is an okay person because you can relate now to this person, right? We all sort of have those things in our minds going on. So beyond these three, the identity, dependence, and social bonding, there are a few other dimensions that are out there in the literature. They've not been really studied much. They deserve much more of examination. We have something called familiarity, and this comes from a place becoming special because there are memories associated with that place, remembrances about this place, and it's all sort of in our mind. We have these special ideas. There's a sense of belonging, where sometimes you just go to a place and you feel, I belong here. this is very much, I feel comfortable here. And so there's this idea of belonging. And on the other hand, there's something called rootedness, which is sort of like belonging, but it goes much deeper. It's a sense of home, of being there, of landing in a place and going, I get this place. This is me. This is where I come from. This is my home. So these are sort of being teased, and they're out there in the literature. And they still need some sort of teasing out to get at the bottom of this. I want to show you some examples, just local examples of what we are studying regarding place attachment in the valley. A student of mine did this study about 2010, I believe is when he did it at South Mountain Park. We were interested in place attachment and sort of how it plays out. And you will see, if you look at what is called place identity, remember this is the dimension that gets at the fact that a place really feeds into a person's self-identity. If we look at the numbers, I'm not going to ask you to decipher those. All you need to know is that what it's showing us is that people who are recreating at South Mountain Park feel very attached to the park because it says something about how they identify themselves. South Mountain Park is a big part of their identity. We are seeing on a scale of 1 to 5, on average across, we had five different trails, a mean of above 4, which means that people sort of are tending to agree or strongly agree that South Mountain Park says something about who they are as individuals. This is really important. This is, people are really tied psychologically to this place. For social bonding, the Pima Trail came up as something that people, it sort of was very important compared to the other trails. And if any of you hike on Pima Trail, maybe you can sort of identify with this idea of, well, people, it's a very social experience, maybe being on that trail or meeting people, or maybe that's why people are going there. But you can begin to take place attachment results and sort of try to get a sense of who is going there and what are they doing there and why is this place important for them. Now, those are really tiny figures, so don't worry about this. This was a study done at the Maricopa County Parks. And again, across the board, we see people are very much attached to the parks here. But if we take McDowell Mountain, the McDowell Mountain Preserves, we see that people are very, very attached to this. Of all the county parks, this is the one that really stands out for them. And what does this mean? I'll sort of touch on it at the end of the presentation. But here's information that a manager can go, oh, wait a minute, people coming here really care for this place. How does that play out? I did a similar study on place attachment in my other backyard, which is halfway across the world in India, because I'm very interested in urban spaces. There's a lot of research that goes on in the wilderness and sort of national parks out there, but I'm very interested in urban spaces such as this. This is the most accessible to people. This is that first place where people go out and experience nature. And if we can sort of understand the experiences here, then there's a better chance of getting people to go out and experience the other nature that is out there. And it sort of allows us also to bring that nature much, much closer to people. It's not something, nature is not considered something separate. So I did this study in India in an urban park that is located right in the middle of the city. This is managed by the forest department out there and is very much part of the identity of the city. Anyone who lives in this city knows about this place, knows that it's a weekend ritual to go there in the mornings and spend time if you're able to. Interestingly enough, also in this study, I found people were very attached. Both the identity sort of came out to the top, which didn't surprise me, but it now gave everyone a reason for going, yeah, now I understand. Yes, there is empirical proof in a way that this is an important place for the identity of the people in the city. It was also an important place for social bonding. And I was there collecting data and would see that people would climb up, meet their friends there, and then go down their separate ways because this forested area is a little hill in the middle of the city. So people would come from different parts of the city. They would never go to each other's homes. But they'd come up there, they'd meet, they'd have their dogs running around, sort of interacting in the morning, and then they'd go back to their separate lives. And they've been doing this for years. So this is a place, again, that is supporting these relationships for people in the city. So, okay, we know that these places are important for people. What does that mean? What do we do with this kind of information? There's been quite a bit of work going on. One, to figure out, well, how does place attachment form? And once it does, what does it do or what does it mean for other things? So in sort of looking at the work or the research that talks about how it forms, we see that the more a person uses a place, the more a person goes to a place, the stronger their attachments develop. Sort of makes sense. We also see that the more involved a person gets in an activity that they're doing at a place, the more attached they are. So you think of a novice hiker versus someone who is much more experienced. The more involved they are, the more central that thing is to their life, the more central that activity is to their life, the more attached they get to that place. We also see that certain motivations allow people to get attached to places. So for example, it could be that the more I want to learn about something, the more attached I'm going to get to that place. So your motivations are going to affect how attached you get to those places. And once you do get attached to places, well, how does this translate into other things? We are seeing that the more attached people get to places, the more sensitive they become to impacts. And interestingly, this is the most interesting one because it can go two ways. The more attached I am to a place, the more I feel I belong to this place and I'm not going to see the impacts because there cannot be impacts here. I love this place so much. And I'm going to keep coming back here because this is my place. Or it could go the other way where you're so attached to this place that you now see the impacts and you become very sensitive to what impacts are happening there. So we are seeing both of that in the literature. And I don't know if you know this, what has been happening at Echo Canyon with everything being shut. I'm wondering whether maybe there's some of this going on there. We don't know. But maybe that people just feel this is our place and therefore want to keep going there. We also know that the more attached people are to a place, the more environmentally responsible behavior they show. We know that the more attached they are to a place, the more support they will have for fees at that place. This was done at a study. This was a study done at one of the U.S. Forest Service sites. But it definitely is showing that people then are more engaged, are more willing to pay a fee, and are more willing to sort of work with management on that. Other things that we've found out, the more attached people are to places, the more likely they are to participate in any kind of civic action. So whether it's fundraising, whether you were talking about fundraising, but this is it. When people are attached, they're more likely to raise funds, to volunteer their time, to participate in events at these kinds of places. So you can see how it feeds into this whole idea of civic action. Some of my work, the last three sort of focus on some of the work that I have done in the past. We find that people who are more attached to places seek more authentic experiences because they know better. And so they're looking for something that's much more authentic. They also exhibit pro-environmental attitudes. There is a correlationship there. The higher the place attachment, the higher the pro-environmental attitudes that they will have. And interestingly enough, also, in the first time we talked about how motivations feed into place attachment. Some of my recent work has showed that sometimes place attachment will motivate people to behave in certain ways. So I'm very attached to a place, and therefore I want to learn more about that place, or I want to bring my friends to this place, or I want to come in and volunteer. So there's a whole bunch of motivations that then are sort of related to place attachment. Just some interesting work that's there. I have the Canyon de Chelly because that's where we, with a colleague, Dave White, who some of you might know, we collected some data on place attachment and authenticity, and we did this study at Canyon de Chelly. It's sort of very interesting. So we know all of this, but we don't know enough. there's still so much more to be done out there. And there's sort of two areas that the research is headed out into. One is to try and understand what are the additional dimensions. I talked about identity and dependence and social bonding. And I mentioned the three other: familiarity, belongingness, rootedness. But those six do not define the entire range of experiences and reasons why we get attached to natural places. So that's sort of one area that I'm focusing some of my work on, and it's really exciting to sort of move in that direction. And then, of course, once we figure out these dimensions, trying to understand how they relate to several other things. And that's sort of another area. Like, we know now that place, attachment, and civic action are related. So what other variables can we use to sort of figure out what these relationships are? Just to quickly sort of go through, I wanted to talk about one or two things that I'm focusing on in terms of the dimensions. I'm interested in this idea of spirituality, which is the non-religious aspect of being out in nature and feeling a sense of oneness with nature, feeling a sense of sometimes smallness in the big picture, especially when you climb a mountaintop or you're on a cliff and you're looking out and you go, geez, I mean, my problems, they're really nothing compared to what I'm seeing out here. I'm sure some of us experience these kinds of things. And how do we tap into this idea that nature allows us, places allow us to experience these things? It's very hard to tap into spirituality, like trust, like honesty. These are hard. You cannot take a measure and go and measure these. They're intangible values, but they are important values. We know that historically spirituality has not really been included in management, but recently in the last decade or so, we're seeing a greater recognition that nature allows us these kinds of experiences. There is a lot of qualitative work out there that sort of people are talking about what they feel, connections that I feel to the spirit, to myself, to the area, a touch of heaven. These are words that people are using when they're out in the wilderness, describing their experiences. Sense of timelessness, a sense of complete peace. These are sort of qualitative data that we are seeing. We are also seeing that places then serve as sort of the crucible within which these kind of experiences are coming to be, and natural, natural attributes of places allow for this. So sometimes it's a tree or lightning or being on the mountain or a waterfall. Any of these elements of nature allows us to sort of experience these things. And so I was interested in finding out what these links are between places, natural attributes of places, and the sense of, again, the non-religious spirituality that we experience in nature. I'm testing some items out there, these statements that try to get at those, and I tested this at a place in India where it's a plateau. You can see the sort of winding road that takes you up there on a mountaintop. And it's a place that has a unique ecosystem. Wildflowers bloom only within 2 short months. That's about it, because that's the only time that there's rain up there. And up to 50,000 people will go there in a day just to see the wildflowers. And it's a huge problem for the forest department there, because they really don't know how to manage all these people. But it's a unique place, and it's, again, like I said, a mountaintop. So I was interested in studying place, identity dependent, social bonding, yes, but also these two new dimensions that I'm thinking about, spirituality and place as nature. And interestingly enough, in this place, I see that the reasons that people are attached to the plateau that I'm talking about are because it's a unique place, it has a unique ecosystem, so I'm looking at the physical attributes of the place, and because there's a sense of peace and oneness with nature when they're out there. And these sort of are higher than the place being something that feeds into their identity or feeds into this social aspect of going with friends and everything. So you can sort of roughly see from the bar chart up there, the two highest ones are actually getting at that idea of places, spiritual and places as a unique piece of, or having sort of a unique ecosystem linked in there. So what does this all mean ultimately? I mean, there's all this research out there. We know they're intangible values. We know they're important. What it does is by being able to study place attachment, by being able to sort of figure out why people are getting attached, it allows us to begin to think about integrating these values into public land management. It's taking an intangible and sort of the human aspect of how we interact with nature and sort of including it when we're making these management decisions about lands. It sometimes allows for ways to distinguish as well as to sort of bring key stakeholder groups together. You might have hikers and mountain bikers who are sort of having conflict at a place. However, you figure out that, well, one identifies with the place, one depends on the place. Then you're able to make management decisions and say, okay, maybe if we want to reduce conflict, we can see if we can provide another place that place dependence people can go to instead, and sort of you can mitigate conflict like that. But it allows you to start looking at looking at people who are going out there and sort of categorizing them differently. It also identifies individuals who would be really good people to be included in the public involvement process. And you've got to remember also, it could go both ways. This is a group that is really engaged, that will really, it makes sense to put time and money into engaging with these people who are very attached. But this is the same group of people who could get very annoyed if they were left out, right, of the public involvement process, because they're very attached to this place, they're very involved with what's going on, and as an agency, if we don't involve them, then it can go either way. But it helps you identify who these people are. And place attachment then becomes a good barometer over time for saying, well, how are people relating to this place? How over 5 years or 10 years, what role does this place play for the people who are coming here? So lots of different ways that you can think about how place and the work that goes around place sort of feeds into the work that most of you are involved with. So with that, I'll stop. I'll take any questions or any clarifications, anything. I'll sort of keep it open to you. Well, one is by doing this place research, we'll be able to figure out what it is about the change that is affecting the attachments. And then ultimately it might be education, or it might be listening to what people are saying. I don't know, it's ultimately then a management decision as to what you decide, what kind of changes are going to take place there. We do know the fact that you pointed out that the more attached people are, the greater resistance in some ways they are to any kind of change, because they like what they have, and that is what draws them to that place. But yes.
As changes happen in the parks, has anyone studied whether people have become more or less attached or attached differently as either human or nature has changed the parks?
I haven't seen many studies in that, no. Like I said, place attachment studies are fairly new. Sort of the first 2 decades was spent on what do we even define, how do we even measure this, and it's only in the last decade or so that we've started moving to, okay, now that we can measure it, how does it relate to other things? So if I get a graduate student, that would be a great thesis topic. But yes, that is an important thing to know, though. There hasn't been any work on ethnicity as yet. Sort of that's another area that I'd like to go into. I've done some work sort of on language, so we're measuring this in English. It makes sense for English-speaking population. If I want to measure place attachment in a non-English speaking, non-Caucasian population, how do I measure it? And what the results are showing me is that you cannot simply translate. So I cannot take this English statement and translate it into another language and go and measure something. I'm doing it, it's wrong to do that. The way we measure place attachment has to come from within the culture and within that language. And so it's almost like if the way we've measured and sort of done all this work and sort of come to this understanding of measuring place attachment in English, similar work needs to be done in other cultures, in other languages. And I think only then can we begin to start comparing how does this ethnic group identify with a place versus this ethnic group identify with a place. So it's an area that I'm also interested in, and it's going to take a few years, but it's an important area. Because I cannot just translate it into another and assume that another culture is going to relate the way that this, the way I'm measuring it relates. So.
And she knows that because you tried it.
Yeah, I tried it. I mean, I have a paper on that where I did the translation and it didn't work. And that has sort of put me back to understanding. I'm doing this work in India where I've said the English one worked perfectly fine, which means that for an English-speaking population across the world in India, the statistics ran the way they were supposed to run. But the moment I translated it and tested it with a non-English speaking population, it didn't work. And essentially what I'm doing now there is building from ground up, because it's, you know, again, it's the idea of building something that is culturally relevant in the language that it's going to be used at. So if I'm to do that in the United States with other sort of ethnic groups too, we have to follow the same thing. We cannot just translate and assume that we are measuring the same thing. So, yes?
Related to her query, was there any gradient in response from rural to more urban respondents?
I haven't done any work on that yet to see that. Yeah. So.
One more question?
You already answered my question.
Okay. Okay.